All right, this set of videos will focus on factorial ANOVA. As we'll see, factorial ANOVA is going to look a lot like regular old ANOVA with one factor, except we have multiple factors. So we expand things there, but it doesn't, it's really based on the same logic. We'll see that we now have some additional issues to deal with. In particular, most important one is dealing with interaction effects. All right, so two-factor between subjects variable. Again, the factor, also known as the independent variable or the grouping variable. We've previously looked at one-factor designs where we compare means across two or more groups. And those groups are called the level of the factor. None of that changes with factorial ANOVA. We're going to deal with factorial ANOVA where we have multiple factors. So in the example that we looked at for one factor ANOVA, we talked about the type of treatment and whether they were differentially effective in reducing bulimia symptoms. Here we can look at not only the type of treatment, but also the length of treatment. So we have multiple factors here. All right, we have some new terminology, two terms, main effect and interaction. Main effects are the differences in scores on the outcome variable or the dependent variable that are attributable to differences on that factor alone. That is, ignoring everything else, are there different means across the levels of one of the factor? Now, an important piece of terminology here, that phrase main effect might lead you to think that those are the most important effects, but it's actually the opposite. These are not the most important effects. They're just the most basic ones we see. And oftentimes they're rendered irrelevant by the presence of what's called an interaction effect. The interaction is the differences in the scores on the outcome variable that are attributable to the combination of the influences of the two factors. It's not factor A, it's not factor B, it's some combination of the two acting together. Factorial ANOVA is the statistical procedure most commonly used to get at those relationships. And we'll see that the big change here is instead of getting one null hypothesis, we actually end up with three, one for each main effect and one for the interaction. Now, I'm talking about factorial ANOVA in the context of a two-factor ANOVA. Factorial ANOVA encompasses two or more factors. So you could have three-factor designs, four-factor designs. I would say practically anything more than a three-factor design, you're probably trying to do too much. All right. Comparing the two different designs. If you look at a one factor, we might take 150 people and assign them to one of three groups. With the two-factor design, we break our people up in even more ways. So here we've got three different groups, but we also have short-term and long-term. What's going to be useful here is that we're going to be able to ask questions that are very specific, like, does short-term work better for a certain approach? Does long-term work, is long-term the only thing that works for approaches? So we're going to be able to ask finer-grained questions. We have a bunch of mean values now that we're going to deal with. A1, A2, and A3, referring to the levels of the means or the different factors, factor A, the means for the different levels of factor A. And then B1 and B2 being the short-term means. We still have a grand mean or an overall mean, but we also have means for what are called the cells. The cells are just those combinations that we see there. Short-term in cognitive behavioral, that's one of the cells. So we have 6 cells here. Some sources will further note this with A1, B1, A1, B2. I prefer not to go to go that deeply into the notation. All right, comparing to the one-factor ANOVA, we again take the sums of square and break it into between and within. But with the two-factor ANOVA, we go a little further. The between group isn't the end point. Once we get the between group, we then break that down into what can be attributed to factor A, what can be attributed to factor B, and what can be attributed to the interaction. The sums of square within side remains exactly the same, and that's going to end up in the formula to produce the denominator for our F test. So you can see 3 sums of squares matches our 3 null hypotheses. We're going to end up with 3 F tests. All right. So taking the therapy example one step further, main effect for factor A, that would ask the question, are there differences between the control group, cognitive behavioral and psychodynamic groups? This is a test of the overall means there for those groups, regardless of whether it was short-term or long-term. Short-term and long-term are just collapsed here. So this is looking at just the overall means for the different levels of treatment, or the different types of treatment. Then we have a main effect for factor B, and that's the length, asking if there's differences between long and short-term therapies. Again, this is going to examine the difference between long and short-term, regardless of what type of therapy they had. And, honestly, that's probably not really even a question that we're interested in. It's just part of the stuff that gets tested along the way to testing. What we're really interested in is the interaction. Interaction between therapy type and length. The null hypothesis is not specified with a formula. It's simply specified as there is no interaction. The question that would be asked here is, do therapies work differently depending on the length? Can we say, well, short term is good for only certain types of therapies, but not others? The effectiveness of the therapy depends on the length. For example, we might see the case where cognitive behavioral therapy works well both long and short term, but psychodynamic only works if it's long term. Here's a graphical example of this. You can see we've got a control group who have more symptoms. Cognitive behavioral group, they seem to be doing well in both short term and long term. And there where that interaction is happening, that has to do with the short term and the long term being different in one condition. We see that there's no difference between short and long for control and cognitive behavioral. But when we have this situation where the effect of one factor is different across the levels of the other, that's an indicator of an interaction. And we can see here, the way this plays out is that short-term psychodynamic therapy doesn't work, but if it goes long-term, it can be just as effective as cognitive behavioral. Again, getting in that it depends piece that's so central to all psychology. In terms of the main effects, you can think of this as examining the differences between these, between the means for the control group, cognitive behavioral and psychodynamic. Notice that these are just the means averaged over the short term and the long term within each of those. So short term and long term don't play into this question. And again, this can be a question that may not be very interesting. It doesn't really describe the results in full. When we perform this test, we would find that the type of treatment did make a difference. Well, and we would say, psychodynamic was more effective than the control group. But again, that's not really the whole picture. That interaction effect is telling us that psychodynamic's only effective in the long term. So those main effects, sometimes they're there statistically, but they're not really informative. The main effect for factor B, that's just the left-hand bars versus the right-hand bars, or the red and the blue as they're noted here. So that's the mean of short-term versus the mean of long-term. And we can see those means are relatively close. So it might be the case that we find that there's no difference between short-term and long-term. But again, that's the sort of conclusion that is kind of qualified by the interaction. We wouldn't really want to say overall there's no difference between short and long term. Short and long term doesn't matter for control, obviously, or the cognitive behavioral therapy, but it does matter for psychodynamic. The interaction, that's when we get into this process of looking at the effects of one factor. We can do this with the length because it's simplest to do graphically. Are the differences between short and long term the same for the control group and cognitive behavioral therapy? Yeah, they're both the same there, but they differ for the psychodynamic. And when you have that pattern wherein the effects of one factor differ at the different levels of the other factor, that's a hallmark of an interaction. All right, this is an example that comes from some work I did way back when I was in graduate school, but it makes a nice example. It's a questionnaire where participants rated a candidate for an HIV/AIDS education program. There were actually 6 different versions of the questionnaire, and in that questionnaire, we showed them a video interview with the candidate, and we modified two different things. First was the stated sexual orientation of the applicant. All of the videos were of the same man, and he identified, his interest. I believe his interest in HIV began when an ex-boyfriend or an ex-girlfriend, called him to say that they were HIV positive. A few other pieces cemented the sexual orientation piece. And then we also looked at the applicant qualifications: highly qualified, moderately qualified, or not at all qualified. I'll talk about those in a sec. So I already talked about how sexual orientation was manipulated. Qualifications: highly qualified. It was obvious that the person was qualified. They basically had served as an assistant AIDS education coordinator, and they pretty much in their old job did everything that is required for the current job. Ambiguously qualified: they were an AIDS education volunteer. Not really clear what exactly they did. And then not qualified: I was very clear that their only experience was handing out condoms on Valentine's Day or something. So the dependent measures, we had a couple: qualification ratings and recommendation. Hypotheses, are the research hypotheses I'll focus on first here. Our research hypotheses were focused on what's called an adaptation of what's called aversive racism theory. What that theory states is that when it is clear what sort of evaluation people should make, when it's clear that someone is either not qualified at all or someone is highly qualified, you won't really see any biases between stigmatized and non-stigmatized groups, because the people making the ratings realize, hey, if I rate this gay person really poorly, even though they're highly qualified, it's going to look like I'm homophobic. Now, the theory goes on to state that when you're interpreting ambiguous stimuli, that's when the biases come out. When bias can be justified for some reason other than the person's sexual orientation in this case, that's when the biases are going to occur. All right, some other design issues. We pre-tested things. We did manipulation checks to make sure everybody was identifying aspects correctly, was rating qualifications the way we thought. So let's take a look at the results. What do we have here? Well, you can see for not qualified and highly qualified, it's pretty much the case that overall we had no differences between heterosexual and gay applicants. However, consistent with the theory, when we looked at ambiguously qualified applicants, the gay applicants actually were rated worse than the heterosexual applicants. That's where the interaction here is coming from. And you can see how that interaction really does focus on the sort of hypotheses, the sort of research hypotheses we stated. Now, if we were to go in and look at the main effects here, we'd find a main effect for qualification, but that's not really interesting. Who cares? Qualified people were rated as having higher qualifications. Who cares? We'd probably find no effect for orientation, because two of the differences are negligible. But though again, those main effects don't really tell the whole story. It's the interaction that tells the story. The interaction is what tells us, well, are people biased against gay men? Well, it depends on the situation. And then for hiring recommendations, we see another type of interaction. We see not qualified and then ambiguously qualified. The heterosexual applicants were rated, were recommended more highly. But then for highly qualified, we see kind of a rebound effect, where the gay person is getting is getting even better hiring recommendations than the heterosexual person. So again, we see different effects at each of the different levels in this case.